Yeah, so welcome to Kush, ancient Sudan, also known as Nubia, or at least Upper Nubia, Southern Nubia. And I was just saying that this is really a lot of emphasis on royals, unusual for my shows. I'm not a royalist, but it is the archaeological record that we have in this case, and it does present a very strong counter-narrative to the way African history is usually presented to us, especially outside of Egypt. Everybody knows about the pharaohs, but they don't really know a lot about what was going on in the central Nile Valley. Nile is really long. You've got the Blue Nile, the Atbara, going way south all the way toward Uganda. And so Sudan is a really big country as it stands now. But what we're going to be talking about in this show is northern and central Sudan. And some of these kingdoms go down pretty far south to the Sixth Cataract, actually. And I'll play all of that out. But I wanted to start, well, here actually, just to talk about the cataracts, because this is just so difficult for us to imagine, to envision, because it's just useful to have a way to visualize all this, since it's all so unfamiliar to us. So here's the modern Egyptian border. We're going to be looking at Nabta Playa in very short order here. But the Nile makes this big S-like curve, and this is hundreds and hundreds of miles. So here's the Blue Nile going into Ethiopia. I was wrong about that. I guess it's the White Nile that goes to Uganda. Here's the Atbara River. But the area we're going to be looking at here the most is going to be Kerma, is shown here. And that's one of the early civilizations. And then this complex here, Nuri, Gebel Barkal, this is the Napatan Dynasty. We're going to be looking at in the second half of the show. Some very important. This is where the pyramids are. These are the Nubian pyramids. And then if you go further up past the Fifth Cataract, and this is pretty far south, there's Meroe. And not too far from there, also Mussawarat-es-Sufra and Akka. So these are also, there's more pyramids here. Just to give you a range of these locations. And we can come back to this in comments at the end if you want to, after you've seen all this, just to kind of recuperate understanding and integrate it at a different level. But I want to begin with the very deep, deep Neolithic. And there are some very ancient pottery traditions in Sudan, which archaeologists have identified as having ties to the Sahara. So they think there were Saharan migrations to the Nile Valley sometime in like the 8th millennium BCE. And they left these pottery shards, and they're calling these Mesolithic, even though, I mean, technically Neolithic is what you call, there's pottery, but be that as it may, you got the dates there. And you can see a lot of this incision marked or wavy line marked pottery. These wavy lines is one of the patterns that they see in the Central Sahara and in Algeria. There were rivers in Algeria in 5000, 6000 BCE. And so the women would take the skeletons of fish and use them to mark these wavy lines onto the ceramics. And you'll see a lot of different styles, lots of incised styles. And these will continue all the way up to the end of this show, into the Meroitic period. There continues to be this pattern. Marking pottery this way is really characteristic of the older ceramic traditions. For example, the Jomon culture in Japan. We can look at a variety of different pottery styles in different parts of the world. And yet we'll see it in Sudan side by side with the painted pottery a little bit later on. But these are all very, very ancient. And you can see there's not any intact pottery. But these are people who are raising cattle, they're farming, they're herding. And you can see that they're making beads out of ostrich shells. You've got bone lip plugs, which you see in various parts of the world. This may be a female figurine. It's been painted with red ochre. A lot of very abstract styles going on at this time. And then over across the Egyptian border, I just want to throw this in because it is part of the context, the larger Eastern Sahara context of the stone formations, stone circles. And this is Nabta Playa, where you have evidence of alignments of these stones, sight lines going to the peaks on the horizon, especially for the setting and rising of the sun and moon. So they're doing astronomy, perhaps astrology, but they're also, this is a ceremonial site. People didn't live here. They came here from all over the place. And they also buried the dead here. And one of the things that they've discovered are there are these cow megaliths. There was a whole cattle thing going on. And what they did is they dug under the ground and exposed blocks of rock, which they would then craft into a sacrificial site for burial and also cow burials in these places. So this is all much more to be fleshed out, but this emphasis on cattle is very characteristic of northeastern Africa and the Sahara too as well. So some of the oldest things we have, and there's not really much way to date this, are petroglyphs, rock writing, and these are actually, somebody's colored these in with chalk to highlight them. But here's a different style of the vulva petroglyphs, which you find all over the planet, and including in the Nile Valley. Here's some other examples, just very rough vulvic triangles along with other symbols. This looks like an animal, and that association of vulva, animal, motherhood, birth, fertility, very strong in this pattern of vulva rock art. And some of these may or may not be vulvas. There's a lot of resonance of these sort of portal shapes that we see in rock art all over Northern Africa, but also in other places in the world. But finally, in the Neolithic, we start to see, even before pottery, stone figurines that vaguely look like human shapes. More so when we compare these with the ceramic figures, you'll see more of a resemblance. But crafted out of stone, this one has this very interesting marking, which we're going to see also on the clay figurines. But, just vague shoulders, vague head, hips, kind of a little bit of a bend here. We're going to see that too in the ceramic. And this one is upright, crafted out of a single piece of stone, and they've incised eyes. So these have sort of an ancestor valence to them, the way that I interpret this. So there's a couple major sites. El-Kadada is one. This is El-Kadroga, and this is very early in the Sudanese Neolithic. A lot of them have these pinched faces, maybe breasts, maybe arms wrapped around the body. That one's just plain clay. And here's some more masterly ones that are really characteristic of the style at El-Kadada. I don't know how many more figurines actually exist that haven't been published. This is sort of an ongoing attempt to uncover them. But this figure here, we very commonly see this vestigial arms, kind of just indicated by the shoulder bumps, the incisions on the body, possibly representing scarification, as we still see in Central Africa, tattoos, perhaps body paint would be another way to look at this. Clearly a pregnant figure. And then you have these markings again. These recur on the clay figurines. We saw a little bit of this just a minute ago, but these lines across the vulvic area, which could represent here bead belts. There's a lot of ways of looking at this. And then this one has kind of a crowned afro headdress. You'll see a lot of the figurines which actually have heads surviving with these slanted eyes on them. This one's got a necklace, and many of them also have a bulbous lower body, like this here as well. And some of the patterns here recur from what we were seeing in the actual pottery. I'm pretty sure this is a view of the same figurine from different angles. But, it's like here you see a necklace there, maybe. And again, the slanted eyes. So some people see these as phallic heads, and that does actually come up pretty clearly in the pillar head at this site, Halfa Derem. Very classic Nile Valley figurine for the period around 4,000, 3,400 BCE, in that range. So just like the pottery, not painted, just incised, just sculpted. And again, these markings around the vulva and womb, which in this case are kind of a vibrant field in curved shapes. She has her hands curled around under her breasts, the pillar head with the slanted eyes, heavy hips, big thighs, legs together, body tilted back. This is a classic form, not only for Sudan, but I'll show you again in a minute from Egypt. Here's another one in that same shape. And again, these lines just below the belly, under this little ridge of belly fat. My head's fallen off of this, but you can see traces of red ochre. And this time the legs are not articulated as we saw in the previous example. The entire lower body is a mass of clay, but she has that same bend. It's kind of a strange thing because nobody really sits with their body leaning back that far. So I'm not really sure exactly what that's about, but we see the same shape in the Nakada culture from Neolithic Egypt. This is in pre-pharaonic times. And pretty much identical in shape, the slanted eyes, the hands to the breasts, the big butt and thighs, the legs together, except here cast with slip and painted. So you've got these painted patterns all over her body. And they've also added on to her bitumen to represent her hair. This one is really hard to see how bent it is, but I'm conjecturing that she's bent much like the other example we saw in stone from Sudan. So I'm just throwing those in by way of comparison. Now here's another angle of view of the Hobagi Tum figurine. These are actually two angles of view for her. And then this is a different figurine from the same site. And here we see something different because here she has a face, but the lower part of her body is a phallus. And I call this a co-sexed figurine. There's this merging of the masculine and feminine with a predominance of the maternal, but you have the generative power of progeneration on the male side also being included in there. And so here are some really fine examples of the incised pottery from El-Kadada, which is one of the major sites of what they call the A group. And I would love it if they would come up with a better, a less, I don't know, sterile term for this classic, the earliest great Nubian civilization. You can see the continuation of these curvature patterns, some very fine stippled patterns that happen throughout this period and on for the next several thousand years. This also shows, this is actually supposed to be a goblet. You can't place it on the bottom, so it would have had to be held. Maybe this was for libation. Incised, and then they have impasto, white clay rubbed into the incisions to make the pattern stand out. And this is really characteristic of some of the A group styles. Here's another view of that goblet or whatever it is with it's not very uncommon to see vessels, especially ceremonial vessels from the ancient world, which cannot be placed on the ground. They have to either be put into a stand or on a tripod or something like that. We see this in Japan. We see it even with the Vestal virgins in ancient Rome. But here we're seeing it in Kush. Anyway, lots of geometric patterns, concentric squares, lots and lots of incised and painted patterns of triangles. We have the quadrant turning up over and over again. And also the grinding stones. This is a very sad looking representative from the sorghum or millet family, which is one of the staffs of life in Northeast Africa. It's a grain that people depended on greatly. And so this beautiful carved grinding stone, this would have been part of ordinary women's daily life for thousands of years along this central Nile region of grinding grain on stone metates like this. I'm not sure about the dates. These could be much later. They're from the site of El-Kadada, but probably from the Meroitic period, maybe several thousand years later. And you do find little clay female figurines, which is characteristic of most of the Neolithic societies we see in Africa, Asia, Europe, very many parts of the Americas, and many of them broken, as you can see here, but a predominance on female figurines. Here's one of those backward-leaning seated women that we've been seeing, different style, broken, though we're just seeing fragments. And then some really gorgeous red ochre painted pots, vessels. Maybe these are water vessels with very narrow bases, though. Again, easy to tip something like this over, but very fine painting and lots of emphasis on the red triangle. This is symbolism we see further north in the Nakada painting in Egypt, not in this form all over the entire bowl, but usually in combination with scenes of mountains along the sides of the Nile in that context. But here The pattern itself is the central theme. And this beauty, very abstract form, very modern looking in some ways, of leaves, which are both painted with the red ochre and incised. And here we've got this stippling pattern. We're going to see a couple other examples of this that is then rubbed with white impasto to kind of set off the pattern that's been incised. Here's some examples that are just simply painted with ochre. This color is not true. It's a duotone, but that was what I could get. Now this is a really important piece because the A group culture has the oldest ceremonial clay stands that I know of. There's kind of a lineage that appears to begin in Sudan. And I haven't seen anybody write about this, but this is what I'm saying, because I found this picture from the Oriental Institute in Chicago of A group ceramics. And we have these tall cylindrical stands that are of a type we later see in the Canaanite and Cretan societies, that usually there would be an offering bowl placed on top of them, that commonly often have openings in them. Offerings can be placed in them. And you'll notice this one has snakes coiling their way up the stand. Would love to get a better picture of this one. This is maybe 3000 BCE. It's the oldest example of what are later called the snake tubes by archaeologists. First at Bet Sha'an in the Canaanite world, maybe 1500 BCE, and then later around the 1200s in Crete. You have these ritual stands that have serpents coiling around them. But here we're seeing the earliest example of it coming out of the Nile Valley, very far south too. More from El-Kadada. Here's more of the impasto style of ceramic art. And this one is found in Sudan, but you do see a lot of overbleed stylistically between what we're calling Egyptian and what we're calling Sudanese or Kushan. There is a lot of trade and cultural exchange going on between these different regions of the Nile Valley. And so here, these patterns are characteristic of D-ware in the Nakada culture of Egypt. But the cattle here is much more characteristic of the Kushan style. And this overlap extends also, now this is really on the Egyptian side of the border, but it's part of the A group culture, the cultural pattern. The Kustal censer, limestone incense burner, and this is the only really good picture I've been able to find of it, which is not of the crucial side. This drawing reconstructs something that was like really shook up the Egyptology world, because you have a ceremonial boat with a pharaoh, a man with a ritual beard of the pharaoh, wearing the crown of the south, which would be Nubia, the white crown of the south, and holding the flail in his hand. So this is all pharaonic iconography, but it's being found in a context that is showing interplay between Kush and Kemet, what we're later going to call Egypt. So that's the A group. And there doesn't really seem to be much in the way of a B group, so it's not even really consistent. But then they start to talk about the C group. And the archaeologists think that there was a wave, another wave of people coming out of the Sahara into northern Sudan. And you will see burials like this in the Sahara, what they call cyst graves, big stone slabs. It's a type of megalithic grave that then later had a mound built over it, and then that was in turn edged with stone. And so you can see the dates there. And C group starts to come into play right around the time that the Middle Kingdom is starting in Egypt, just to put this in context. And so their pottery styles are different. And you've got a lot of very thin necks, which is one reason on these figurines why so many of the heads have fallen off of them. You're going to see a lot of figurines with these incised zigzags on the thighs. This is a theme that recurs. Here's another one. Sometimes it's more curly, so it looks like a serpent. That's a motif we see in other parts of the world, Turkmenistan, for example. But more abstract figures, you still see that seated shape, kind of leaning back a bit there. Incisions on the body, which could represent tattooing or scarification. These are hands. So the upper body is missing, but the hands on the thighs. Lots of female figurines, and we do see examples also of a couple male figurines, also incised. And this one interesting because it has what appears to be a ram's head. And the ram god is really important in Sudan, in Nubia. Later on in Egypt, the god Amun comes to the fore. He's not a big deal until the New Kingdom period, where there's a lot of Nubian influence on Egypt. So this is a very strong focus that I will come back to when we look at the Napatan rulers. Anyway, here are some of the missing heads that have fallen off from those figurines. A lot of very flat-faced figurines. Locks on some of them. And then also their ceramic styles. Again, the emphasis on cattle, the incision styles. This one is very similar to ancient Egyptian style from the Nakada period, from this, what they call seaware, with these triangles, these hatched triangles, and then animals, in this case crocodiles, around the rim. Here we've got the serpent incised in a similar way. So they're not so much into the painted pottery in this period. It's more of these etched patterns. A lot of them very geometric. And I can see some continuity here going on with the concentric diamonds or squares. More impasto techniques are continuing. Aniba is one of the main sites of the C group culture. And I'm going to just posit that these are probably made by women, as most ceramic art is, at least until you get into a very class stratified patriarchal imperial society where a lot of the crafts start to go over to men. These are really amazing to me because they are of a style that is very much congruent with the Congo, with the Katanga and the Kasai velvets, some of these patterns. But here we're seeing them in Sudan. So we're again getting these resonances with more of Pan-African connections that are going on. And that also shows up in other ways. We can't really date this rock gong, but you will see these rock gongs in various parts of East Africa. Kenya has a bunch of them. I think I've seen examples in Algeria. What a rock gong is when you strike it with a stone, it gives off a ring or some kind of a sound. And so there was probably ceremonial use with these. So I want to go backwards a little bit in time, because just to emphasize again, one of the shared patterns between Kemet and Kush is this black on red wear, which begins around 4000 BCE and it continues for centuries. And so we find this in Egypt, but they also find it in Sudan. And one of the places it continues longer in the Kerma culture of Sudan. This is in the northern part of Sudan, but pretty far from the Egyptian border. It looks like raku. It looks like a very modern piece with these mineral patterns. They were masters of glazing. And also just any potters here, you probably know how difficult it is to hand build an extremely thin pot like this. So the Kerma culture attained like really high levels of mastery in this style. And you could see an example like this in modern potters doing similar types of things. So abstract art has very ancient roots here in the Nile Valley. And this is the Kerma culture. It is a class stratified society. And you do have specialists probably working at this ceramic. Kerma itself was thought for a long time to be like a single city, but now they realize there's a whole complex of towns, including on Sai Island, which is one of the primary sites, but also the Nile changed course, and east of the current Nile is an area with a lot of settlements. And when the river changed, then those towns just dried up. And this one too, with a very African looking pattern, beautiful pigments on this in various shades of ochre out of the Kerma culture, possibly a model house. This looks a lot like a roof on some of the clay walled thatched topped houses that you still see in Central and Eastern Africa, various regions. But Kerma was a kingdom, and they had like a huge city. These are the foundations of a massive settlement. In the background there, you're looking at the Defufa, which looks like a mountain, but it was a mud brick building that was several stories tall, which has just been aged by 37, 38 centuries of weather. And so we just have the foundations and then traces of this giant building. It's all been fused. So like, who knows what's inside of there too. The burial mounds at Kerma they had tribute from other parts of Sudan. They were extracting cattle. People were giving cattle to the kings at Kerma. And they were being buried in these mounds. And there were not only sacrifices of multiple cattle, which we see here with all these horns, but also of humans. So there are like 332 humans that were sacrificed that they found at the royal necropolis at Kerma. And this is not a pattern that we see it a couple times in history, it goes away, and then like 1,000, 2,000 years later, it comes back. What can I say? It's, we couldn't really describe this as a matriarchal culture in this context, but here gives you a view of the amount of architecture that's going on. This Kerma culture ruled over an area that was as great as that of the Egyptian Empire in the same time period. We're talking 1800, 1600, 1500. And in fact, Kerma invades Egypt in the 1570s and actually have a very successful campaign for several decades. And it is in the pushback against that, I think it's Thutmose III that pushes the Sudanese back south and actually winds up colonizing Sudan, colonizing Kush as a result. So there's these waves of conquest back and forth in empire. But it's important to know that because there is this tendency to construct Sudan as always behind Egypt or less powerful or less advanced, whatever, that it didn't play out. There's much more complexity to that. And there were various periods in which Sudan becomes a reservoir of renewal of Kemetic culture. And in certain times of history, we'll come to that. Anyway, this is a reconstruction of what maybe the Defufa might have looked like in old times, and some of the buildings, ceremonial enclosures and so forth, including two views of the same thing. This is a block of stone with both elephants and hippos painted on it. They were into the animals for sure. And we see this a lot. I think that's another close-up view, not a very good photo of the same pillar. It's a stone lintel. We also see multiple hippo women or hippo goddesses carved in ivory that were embedded. You can see them here. I think these are the sides of a bed. Now, this would be a burial, and the cushions were known often to bury people in a bed. And so these are probably royal beds, I would guess. But it's really interesting because we have this hippo goddess holding a knife. We also see the vulture, which is very prominent in Egyptian art. And these mountain goats flanking a palm tree. This is a theme that shows some they were trading with West Asia, some connections to there. But here's a good close-up of this hippo goddess with her curved knife. And you'll notice that she has very fierce teeth. Hippos have kind of round teeth. They don't look like crocodile teeth, but there's this kind of fusion between the hippo and the crocodile, which are both waterborne Nile animals in Kushan art. So women who are wearing just a skirt, the upper body is not covered, these curved knives, because these hippo women, is a better look at the sharp teeth, because they resemble so much the goddess of birth, Taweret, of the Egyptians, who also has this curved knife. Well, here's a better example of it. This is interesting because it looks both like the knife and also the crocodile that is usually shown riding on her back. So there's a lot of interplay in the symbolism, but this curved knife may have been used as a midwive's knife to cut the umbilical cord. And Taweret is very definitely she who presides over birth, But also she is the goddess, if we look at the zodiac at Dendera, the temple of Hathor, which is a very late temple, you can see at the very center of the cosmos is Taweret, so the goddess of birth at the center. And we don't have as much reference, we don't really have any hieroglyphics in this period to go by to learn more about the beliefs that the people in Kerma had around this hippo goddess. We just know that she was there. We're looking really at the iconography. And so we see also lizard forms. Here's more of the elephants, some giraffes in mica, and other kinds of, I think this looks like to me like this is incised stone rather than ceramic, with all the running spiral patterns around it. So that's Kerma. And I was just saying, Kerma brings down the wrath of the Egyptian Empire. So the new kingdom begins in the 1500s, and Egypt has been invaded from the north as well by the Hyksos invaders. And their attempt to recover the country from these attacks from both south and north leads into the great imperial expansion of the new kingdom, which is sometimes called the empire period. And so Egypt invades the south. Buhen is in Sudan, and here's this gigantic fortress, and they begin sending troops down, and they begin conquering the southern Nubians. And so you can see this very pejorative name being used, and captives with their arms bound behind their backs, which is, very pretty strong iconography in Kemet going on since the first dynasty, really. We see Egyptian artifacts. So here's a little woman holding a cat in her hand, classic Kemetic style mirrors. But also in the north, we're seeing iconography of Nubians wearing characteristically Nubian dress. This is from the Middle Kingdom period, before Deir el-Bahri, before Hatshepsut built her temple. And so you see a Nubian presence in Egypt and an Egyptian presence in Nubia. But Amara West is one of these northern Sudanese bases where you see presence of Egyptian style art. This looks like an Isis here. This is just fragments of a painting that have survived. And some of the little figurines, very abstract female figurines with these dotted vulva patterns that are something that go all the way back to the early Nakada period, but continuing along. And so the Sudanese begin to have more Egyptian influence around this time frame, starting in the 1500s and then going forward in time. So that this, for example, is a type of ornament that was worn in Egypt with the necklace of Hathor, which is called the menat. So those heavy beaded collars were sacred to the goddess Hathor, who has to do with art and beauty and adornment and dance and music. And this is a counterweight for the back because those were heavy necklaces. So they needed a counterweight so that the necklace would not choke the wearer. They just wanted it to hang in a certain way. And so you see the goddess Hathor and her form as a cow there. But in this period of the 1300s, there are a lot of tribute scenes in Kemetic tombs. So this would be at Thebes, the tomb of, he's an Egyptian nobleman, showing Sudanese captives coming in and paying tribute to Egyptian rulership. And here is a princess who is part of this delegation. Here's another form, maybe the same princess, riding in a chariot, which, unlike in Egypt, is being drawn by cattle. And this is, again, that very characteristically North African theme. This is cut off. I haven't been able to get a good picture of her. Her face has been defaced, number one. She's wearing classical Egyptian collar and pleated linen robes, but on top of her head is this gigantic crown made out of ostrich feathers. And these crowns show up elsewhere in association with the goddess Anuket, who is a gazelle goddess that is also connected with the ostrich feather. But anyway, the Kushan princesses joined those from the Hittites and other parts of the Egyptian empire in the harem of the pharaoh. And these are also diplomatic alliances, as well as the practice of taking captives from the conquered provinces. These are common women. So these are the women of the common people, a completely different style of dress that's much more congruent with our hippo women there in the ivory work. Both the women and the men are wearing locks that are plastered with red ochre. This is a style that you'll still see at times in Ethiopia, Namibia, other parts of Africa. And she has a child on her back in a backpack. So these folks are going into servitude in Egypt. This one is, I'm not really sure about the date, but again, showing the presence of Nubians, because what happens in empires is that the conquered people do end up in the armies of the empire and also the harems, or as slaves. And so there is this slaving that's going on out of Kush into Egypt. But the Medjay, the great longbow warriors of Sudan, become part of the Egyptian army. And we can see this already happening in the Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom periods. This is, I think, on the Egyptian side, but you've got an Egyptianate birth of a Nubian woman giving birth. And so now we come to the Napatan dynasties. And this is a Kushan dynasty that begins just after around 800 BCE. And one of the sources that this is from an Afrocentric scholar that I was on one of the listservs I was on 30 years ago. And he was saying that the earliest known royal name of the Napatan line is that of a queen, Kadimalo. So that's all I've got about her. I don't have a picture of that. But the Kushan line, which is also known in Egyptian history as the 25th or the Nubian dynasty, happens after Egypt has been invaded again by Asiatics. And so according to this account, the Egyptian queens appealed to the women of the Nubians to intercede for their city and to drive out the invaders who had come through the Delta, the Nile Delta. And so King Kashta founds this dynasty, and he begins to liberate southern Egypt. And so you have the priests at Thebes, this is the center of pharaonic power, welcoming him, installing him officially as pharaoh, and the high priestess there, who has the title of the god's wife of Amun, this is the high priestess role of pharaonic women, adopts the daughter of Kashta as her successor. We're going to come back to that in a minute. And then the Piye is not the son of Kashta necessarily. They did not have father to son succession. It was much more sisters and brothers as a generation taking power. And so Piye might have been Kashta's brother, his nephew, we're not really sure. But anyway, he takes over all the way to the Delta region. And this is really counter to pattern with empire. They say that Piye refused to seize captive princesses as concubines, and he was a horse lover. So kind of an interesting figure. So this queen is the wife of Piye, and this begins to introduce us again to a pattern that becomes characteristic during the Napatan and Meroitic dynasties. So we're basically talking about the first millennium BCE and going into the early centuries of our era, which is this pattern. Instead of showing the pharaoh, the male, at the breast of the goddess, as here Isis is suckling this queen who's holding the Ankh, it shows the queen instead of the pharaoh. And we're going to see this pattern in numerous ways, so that there's very much more of an emphasis on the power of the queens than you see in Egypt. That's not to say that Nefertiti and certain queens could not attain power. We see Hatshepsut doing so by assuming the male guise and even male pronouns in order to take that throne. But in Kush, it's otherwise. And so here's Tarharqa. He is the successor to Piye. He is really this great, he unifies Kush and Kemet together, Egypt and Sudan, and is like a major renaissance that he presides over of Egyptian culture. This here is showing his queen, where they're calling her Dikahitamanu. I don't know, the names tend to shift as older scholarship, but you see the god Amun in the foreground here, combined with his consort Mut, the mother goddess, wearing the crown of the two lands there. So the ram-headed god already came into play during the New Kingdom due to Nubian influences in the foundation of that dynasty. Here we see one of the women associated with Tarharqa, and I'm not really sure about this name, Monumpt. God's wife of Amun indicates she is a royal priestess of the Napatan line. There's the characters with her titles, but she's shown as a protector with the bow and arrow. So her as a priestess, as a defender of the country. And you do see very prominent statues in granite and other heavy stones of the Napatan queens. This one, Amani Malel, I don't know who this one is, but everything I'm sharing with you here is a process of ongoing construction, reconstruction, because you're not given a very clear outline. Most sources, you'll get very fragmentary references to the pyramids at Nuri or the pyramids at this other site without any chronology really being in view. So what happens is that Piye and Tarharqa begin again the process of constructing pyramids, and they do so in their homeland of Sudan. This is after the Kemetic Empire stopped building pyramids in the Middle Kingdom. So there's been a lapse, maybe of 1,000 years of pyramid building. And as you can see, the shapes are different. They're much more tall and pointed. They are a lot smaller than most of the Egyptian pyramids, but that is not to say that they are little, because look at the size of this thing with this person in the foreground. And you can also see, like the northern pyramids, they have been heavily ransacked for stone, so there's chunks taken out of them. Here's an aerial view of them buried in sand. They become part of the landscape. But inside some of these pyramids are these amazing, this is at Nuri, one of the sites, one of the Napatan sites where the kings and queens were buried. And these again look like some kind of ritual stand, but this time with gold leaf covering. And very classic Kemetic iconography of Isis, winged, various other symbols going on, the uraeus, flowers, lilies. One of the queens is Kolhata, and she had her own pyramid at El-Kurru, which is another nearby site. Here she is, flanked by the god Horus, and maybe this is her brother, maybe it's a deity, I'm not really clear on this, but a masterpiece of very fine classical Nubian painting, wearing the crown, the vulture crown that's often associated with Isis. You can see that there have been some scratches on her face. I saw just recently another picture that showed even more heavily defaced attacks on this ancient Kandaki. In her tomb, this is a portal into the actual burial chamber. We have Auset and Nebthet. Isis, we can see from her crown with the throne, Nebthet with the characters of the lady of the house. These two sisters holding up, this is very defaced. Oh, actually, this is the one from Kolhata's tomb. That's a different tomb. They're holding up the belt of Isis, which is always red. You'll see it carved also in carnelian because it represents the blood of Isis and the womb of Isis. And here you can see the throne character, which is her hieroglyph and also her crown. So this is a really important symbolism that has to do with the idea that the womb of Isis is full of power, and that piece of cloth that is wrapped around her womb is filled with redness and life force, protective power, life-giving power as a result. Also at El-Kurru, in addition to the pyramids, are these rock-cut temples. And this is really interesting because this is underground rock that they cut away to form a temple. In other words, these are not constructed pillars. They're carved out from the living rock. So this is all the ground level up here, and all of this is underground. And they've actually added some, this side had, they built in a couple some walls on this side. But this is a style of architecture that we see also in Ethiopia later on with the cathedrals in the Christian period, cutting rock out of the ground. Here, the Queen of Piye, or one of the queens of Piye, Tabiri, who is named in this stela, and her title, Great One of the Foreigners. So she was probably a woman from one of the foreign nations or another. All right, this is a really important piece of evidence for Nubian matrilineage. I've already mentioned that there was not a direct succession, king to son to son to son. And the pattern of descent that we see in the Napatan Dynasty is much more consistent with matrilineal societies where you have sister-brother pairs and not that paternal, not a patriline, strictly speaking. So here is King Espelta being installed with the blessing of the god Amun. Behind him is Mut, propping up the male god. And here is Nasalsa, who is the mother of Espelta. And the whole inscription that you see here, you see her holding up the sistrum. So she's performing a ceremonial act while she does this chant, which is actually installing her son on the throne. So in this hieroglyph, she's invoking Amun-Re to establish Espelta on the throne. She mentions his father, but then she just goes off into a 7-generation list with all the honorifics of his matrilineal ancestors. His mother is king's sister, king's mother, mistress of Kush, daughter of Re, may she live forever. And her mother was king's sister, divine adoratrice of Amun-Re. And she goes back naming the queens, Nasalsa, Abar, Kensa, Naparai, and Takahatamani. So this is direct evidence of matrilineal descent. And some of the sources that I was rereading my old files, one of the scholars, Laszlo Turek, refers over and over again to the female succession line. So here is Nasalsa again, an icon from her funerary gear as a mummy, and some of her titles, Mistress of Kush. And she is daughter of Amenirdas of Thebes. So what we start to see happening here, this is actually Espelta again himself, is this pattern that comes into play when Kush rescues Egypt. A deal is made between the priests of Thebes and the Kushan rulers. And they say, all right, look, we're going to adopt you as our pharaoh if you help us get our country back. And we're going to also install, because they saw the pattern of priestesshood, which was so strong amongst the Kushan women, we're going to install your queens as priestesses of Amun-Re. And so they got this title of divine adoratrice, or the god's wife of Amun, which we first see attested in Egyptian hieroglyphics in the New Kingdom period. It becomes a title for high priestesses. So first, the Egyptian priestess, Shepenwepet I, who we see here, is installing Amenirdas I, who is the Kushan queen and the sister of Tarharqa. I think that's right. She's a relative of Tarharqa, in the company of Horus and Isis, or perhaps of Hathor, but I would say Isis because this is a lineage. So this is the tomb of Ramses III. So Amenirdas I becomes the high priestess, who is a ruler in Egypt as well as in Kush. You can see the dates of her reign there. And this gets a little complicated. So what happens, there's a line of these queens who adopt as their direct successor another woman as priestess. So Amenirdas I, in turn, turns around, and these are just more pictures of her from her. The Medinet Habu is her temple in Thebes, her funerary temple where she's buried. So she actually takes up residence in Upper Egypt. Okay, that's her. She adopts in turn as pharaoh, as a priestess, successor, who I'm going to show you in a moment. But here she is with Mat in her hand, the symbol of divine law and truth, facing some king or another in the chapel built by him at Karnak. Here we go. All right. So she installs Shepenwepet II. And that's who we're looking at for sure here. They're not sure if this one is her or Amenirdas II. So, you know, these titles, you're seeing a very definite female power lineage here with these priestesses. And so Shepenwepet II is installed by Amenirdas I, and then Amenirdas I in turn installs Shepenupet or Shepenwepet II. And then she in turn installs Amenirdas II. Do I have her there? I'm just going to go backwards here. All right, so there's these basalt sculptures of these priestesses. And so from about 700 through the 600s, you have these high priestesses of the Kushan line who are ruling at Egypt. And then when the Kushans get pushed out of Egypt, they continue to keep these titles and to act as priestesses, which they had been doing all along to begin with in Napata, way south. So this says Shepenwepet II is Tarharqa's sister. Just still trying to figure out all these relationships. Here she is shown with the Hathor coiffure and as a sphinx. Also Amun-Ra, here the ram god, all those animals together. Here she is again. This is a colossal statue of which apparently the only head survives, wearing the crown with the double uraeus. And this here is probably Amenirdas I. Yeah, with the inscription down the side. So this gives us some idea of the tremendous stature that at least the women of the ruling class in the Kushan dynasty exerted, and a matricentric lineage system as well. And so this is obviously a modern reconstruction of El-Kurru or Nuri, one of the places with these pyramid temples, and the stelae. We're going to continue seeing stelae that were raised in honor of the queens as well as the kings. I haven't gotten an identification of this yet, but this is definitely one of these Napatan queens facing. And again, the queen herself is facing Amun-Ra. So in Egypt, she might be standing behind the king facing Amun-Ra, but very commonly in Kush, she's standing at the center, dealing with the divinities in her own right directly. And they're priestesses, of course they are. Okay, brief interlude now. We're looking at amulets that are made out of faience, which is kind of a glass glaze, terracottas. And we have various enthroned goddesses. We have a lot of Sekhmet, winged Sekhmets though, here, wearing the solar crown with the Wadjet serpent riding on it, and a gigantic Wadjet also here in front. This again, one of the wives of Piye, so this is early in the Napatan Dynasty. These all have different dates. Another queen, not really sure, I guess maybe possibly a queen of Piye's as well, with the uraeus on her shoulders, winged goddess of some form or another. A lot of these, it's kind of hard to look. Who exactly are we looking at? Because we don't yet have any Meroitic script in this area. They're only using Egyptian hieroglyphs. So another queen of Piye, a very good example of the glass glazed faience. And some of the same symbolism repeated over and over again. The serpents, the solar crowned serpents on her shoulders, the winged lion goddess. Those are from pyramids. And then also in ceramic and metal, you find these aegises coming into play. Probably had inlaid eyes at one point. All right, here's another site, Mussawarat-es-Sufra. These pillars, clearly there's Egyptian influence going on here. When you see the fluted columns, people tend to think, oh, the Greeks. But in fact, the oldest fluted columns that we know of historically in the world come from the Saqqara. Is it the Giza or Saqqara? One of the pyramid temples has the fluted columns. So they really begin in Egypt. They get borrowed by the Greeks, and then there's, you know, just also being taken up in Kush. So Mussawarat-es-Sufra site is gigantic. There's a huge temple enclosure. In fact, they actually say there are 3 temples inside this labyrinthine structure. And you can see walls and pillars and all kinds of things going on in there. This was built in the 200s BCE. Some of the pillars, like you see at Karnak, have reliefs. They're very fat pillars, some lotus symbols there. They're much more deeply engraved than the Egyptian counterparts that they had. And they also have these megalithic statues of elephants. And there's a lot of elephant iconography at Mussawarat-es-Sufra, which they think actually, because there are ramps inside this great enclosure, that they may have actually been training elephants in here, that there was a presence of elephants at this site, maybe military use of elephants. It's not really clear. And they also show up on the pillars. And this is, they've built an artificial roof over this to preserve it. Also here at the same site, we have a queen. I'm not sure who she is, but this is a woman. Note the breast. And she has the crown of the south along with horns in the presence of Horus and Isis. And so we continue to see these installation stelae. And the males are at the center of this. So we've got the king facing various gods and making offerings to them. But the women are there too as priestesses. So in one hand, the sistrum, they're shaking their ceremonial rattle. The other hand is pouring a libation out from a narrow ceremonial vessel. Same over here. And so this is the queen mother, Peleta, and over here is the wife, Sahma. And this pairing of the women, it's not always clear to us. Kandaki is a title that we know from Meroitic times. This is still a little bit early days. I'm not sure if that term is in use yet, probably. But we don't know if the Kandaki refers to the queen mother or whether it refers to the king's wife. I would put my vote for the former, because in fact these Kandakis had the power to appoint who would be the king, and also there are known examples of them deinstalling their sons. And so this is a very strong matriarchal pattern that you see, for example, with the Iroquois and the women, the elders, having the ability to take away chieftainship. But also in other parts of Africa, the Ashanti and various other African realms, the queen mother has her own court, her own army, she has ceremonial power, and very often she's the kingmaker. So we're not talking about only the male ruler and then some kind of female sidekick. There is this very strong female influence, political authority, ceremonial authority as well. So now we're coming on to the Meroitic period in the early centuries BCE. And one of the centers of this power was at Gebel Barkal, and this beautiful head, I don't know who she is, but she's one of the Kandakis, which, in spite of the destruction that's been wreaked on her, you can see the incredible expertise of sculpture that they had going on. This one also so far unidentified, except that you have, that looks like a woman at the center there, but these flanked by these women who are again pouring libation on either side of this figure. This is from one of the pyramids. And then these are painted reliefs that are in the 1st century. Oh, this is CE. I've got this in the wrong order. Oh well, Meroitic queen. They're naming her as the Kandaki Nawidemek Naldamak. And it is at Napata, although it says of Meroe. That's a little confusing, but I would assume they're just saying the Meroitic period. But at Napata. And here again, we see the queen as a central figure. She's enthroned, and it is Isis with her wings protectively placed around the queen and not around the male pharaoh. This is very definitely a Kushan pattern, as against the Egyptian one where she's always protecting the male heir. Up here on the upper area, well, first look at this figure. The man standing in front of her is worshiping her by holding out a censer. There's a flame here. He's burning incense before her nostrils. This is an act of veneration. People are coming and bringing offerings to her. I'm going to zoom in close up on this scene here because it's very cool. We've got a group of people, some of whom are deities, Anubis and other deities, pouring libation onto these stone altars. I'm going to show you these libation altars a little further on. Also pouring flowers towards this kandaki. And you have these papyrus crowns and all kinds of interesting things going on. Here's another queen with a similar type of scene. And so this time it is Prince Yetarete burning incense between the Horus queen, Kandaki Nawidemek Naldamak. So it's the same queen, apparently, on her lion throne. She's holding a staff that appears to be maybe reeds. Interesting, because there's this whole Northeast African pattern of river reeds or greenery that's used ceremonially. You see this among the Oromo in Ethiopia right up to modern times. Once again, Isis has her wings around the queen. She's being offered incense, and there's another group here of deities pouring libation. Basically, they're kind of authorizing her rulership. Now, I don't know whether there was a reference in one of my sources at an inscription at Semna West, and it's an inscription at Kadimalo or of Kadimalo. And my historical source here says, the king seems to seek the aid of the deceased queen, referring to her powerful magic. So I don't know if that applies to these murals that I'm showing you, if in fact this is the queen, because there's these rays coming from her, that maybe she's an ancestral woman rather than a living queen. That's a possibility at least to consider. But anyway, we can see here she is again. This is a different image with her, again, the greenery as a staff in her hand, and as well as the staff of rulership with the wajet on it. And underneath her throne, captives. So we begin to see the captive iconography that begins in Egypt, starts to be taken up by the Napatan rulers in some of their iconography. And here it is again below the throne here of Amun. The god Amun is sitting on top. So this spatial subordination of the conquered comes through. But this is another example of the queen herself face to face with the god Amun, who is pretty much like the ruling dynastic god, as far as I can make out, for the Napatan rulers. And then behind her is this queen. Oh gosh, can I remember her name? It'll come up later. I don't have it memorized. Something like Amisemi, a goddess who is associated with the lion god in the Napatan Dynasty. You can see this heavy-duty crownery that she's wearing, and she's directly face-to-face with Amun. Oh, here she is, Amisemi. So the queen here in the presence of Amisemi, whose icon is the falcon god or goddess. And once again, being embraced and authorized and validated by the deity. Interestingly here, the goddess has these facial scarifications, which we see. Oh, I thought it was going to be the next slide. It'll turn up again here in a minute. So anyway, 1st century BCE, 1st century CE, Amanishakheto is one of the queens that we have the most iconography for, because her pyramid was not looted until the 1830s, and this Italian fortune hunter came and leveled the thing and just sacked it. We have fragments that survive all of this. I mean, he was really destructive in the process that he did. You can see that this relief in stone originally was covered with gold plate. There's a little bit of traces of blue paint here in the background also, but there's gold on her regalia. She's shown here holding the Menat necklace of Hathor, so she's making offerings to Hathor. But this is an example of that type of necklace, which is actually buried with this kandaki. And so we see all these sacred symbols, the Ankh of Isis, the Jed, or the symbol of life, really, the Ankh. We see the Wajet, the eye of the sun, scarabs, various symbols. The Shen symbol is in here too, the symbol of infinity. So this is all precious stones, carnelian and other things that were part of her necklace. And here she is again, shown before the goddess Aniseme. This is from the Naka Lion Temple. Here she is again. So we have a lot of iconography and really beautiful sculptures, damaged and ruined as they are. I mean, they've really been subjected to some violence. And here's the scarification I was talking about, the facial markings that you see in West Africa and various other places, possibly as part of womanhood initiation. Here the queen standing behind the god or the king with the sistrum aloft, showing their priestly capacities. This is treasure that was looted by this Italian hunter. So you've got lots of rings and amulets in the form of the goddess Hathor. You've got armbands with very elaborate cloisonné enamel work and granulated decorations. Isis beating her wings. This is a symbolism that has to do with her resurrection of Osiris. He dies, she gathers together all his body parts, she brings him back to life by turning into a kite, which is like a falcon kind of bird with an owl face. And she beats her wings and she beats life breath back into the still heart, long enough to conceive Horus. That's the framework here. So they're all holding the Ankh in their wings because she's bringing life. Here again, Amanishakheto, directly face to face with the ram god Amun. This is one of her signet rings. This one I don't have in color. But again, woman and God. This one's in silver, showing her nursing, mother of the nation. Actually interesting, she got the Horus falcon on her head, symbol of rulership. And here she is, this would be her, this would be her male consort and their royal offspring, the sun. This was also found in her pyramid, this incredible gold and crystal Hathor icon. Jewelry with Hathor dangling from the ears. Ankhs, here's the actual photo of those Hathor with double serpents that I showed before. They loved the Ankh. The Ankh is taken up with great adoration by the Kushites, and it becomes a major part of their sacred symbolism. Here's Hathor, possibly Isis, could be Hathor. Another one of these armbands. This one's a little bit older. Here's another broken chunk of Amanishakheto, and this is from the Gebel Barkal temple, which is still in action around this time in the 1st century CE, but we can see that there are temples that were built there all the way back in the early Egyptian conquest period. So like in the 1300s, and then King Piye adds to it. So there's this very long history, and this is clearly a sacred site, you know, the rock icon itself. Then we have Kandaki Amanitori, and I've spelled it this way. This is technically supposed to be the right spelling, but the Romans recorded this as Kandaki, and I'm just following the way it's usually used, just so people will be able to recognize it. But some sources say Kadaki would be more correct. So here's a drawing of her, of a relief of her facing the lion god Nawidemek. Here's a photograph, not a very good one, at a site called Wad Banaka. Here she is again with the sistrum in her hand and her catafalque. So her sarcophagus is here. She's on a ritual boat that's taking her to her resting place along the Nile. And that resting place is shown here. There's this gigantic stone 4-sided chamber that she was laid inside of. Here she is with her cartouche, naming who she is. It's a close-up of her. And each side of this had some goddess or another. So you've got, this is the southern side, deities, protective deities all around her body. And so also at this Wad Banaka site, is this beautiful Hathor temple. This is quite late, around about the 1st century or so BCE. And again, we have these very gorgeous, there's something characteristic about the Kushan architecture, even though there's clear Egyptian influence, you can see some Hellenistic influences, but nobody does it quite like the Nubians. They just have a certain style. There's a proportionality to it that I can't even think of a word for it. It's just so beautiful. So you can see the layout here, the Hathor kiosk, as they call it. It's kind of a rectangular open air temple. And then beyond that is the Lion Temple of Apademek that I've been referring to. So you can see the initial pylon, that's the entrance, the pharaoh and his co-ruler. So I forget his name, it'll come up in a moment, but this is Queen Amanishakheto, both shown as conquerors on this. And then here we have the Ankh and Rosette theme that recurs over and over again. I'm not sure who this is, might be Amanishakheto herself. Here's a close-up of her as the conqueror, and you can see her with her sword raised. She's grabbed by their hair, all of the conquered nations. This is a motif that originates in Egypt and gets taken up by first the Napatan and then the Meroitic rulers of Kush. So the whole scene here, this is the name of the co-ruler, Nataka Amani. That's the king, and we don't know if they're sister and brother, possibly husband and wife, or if they have some other kinship relationship. But this is Amanishakheto. This is one of the great sculptures, not only of Sudan, but of the world, this amazing relief scene. So you have probably the king here, Isis with captives. I'm not sure who these goddesses are. It could be Isis and Hathor. Notice again, she's holding this staff with the greenery. There's a close-up of Isis right in front of her. Incredible sculpture. I'm not sure who this one is. Some of these are, I haven't managed yet to get the chronology of where they fit in, if these are later or earlier. This one, I'm thinking this is later. And we also see very specifically Nubian forms of Isis. And so this one, not done in classic Kemetic style, and even a little bit of Hellenistic braids there. On the hand to the nursing Horus, a theme that's very widely dispersed in Egypt. And here's a beautiful Ma'at with both wings and her arms, standing behind the Horus, and the king wearing the symbol of Ma'at. This symbolizes one who keeps the divine law. I don't know who this is, maybe Isis, although you don't usually see her cupping her breasts like this. She's wearing the crown of the 2 lands. She's winged. Hathor. So lots of Nubian bling here, representing especially Isis, Hathor, and Ma'at, as well as Amesemi, the Kushan goddess. This is another one of the Kandakis, Amanirdas. The Roman legions invade under the rule of Augustus, and she manages to drive them back. And there's a story behind this, because she actually, we've discovered archaeologically, cut off the head of a bronze statue of Octavian, and then buried that head underneath the feet of the Kushan ruler in one of their temples. And so again, that spatial subordination turned to resistance against the Roman Empire. Now the Ba is a symbol of the soul that we know from Egyptian art, and it begins to appear very prominently in Meroitic art. And so you have both men and women shown with wings. This is the Ba iconography, but in a very specific Kushan way. So we've got these stone statues with these long wings. You know, and the style, everything about the style is Sudanese. It's not Egyptian. We also start to see the Meroitic script coming into play in the early centuries BCE. They have managed to decipher the sounds, but they have not cracked the language. There's no known language that's related to Meroitic So there's a whole mystery here of what is this language? Who is it related to, if any? It's very rare for there to be an isolate that wasn't at one time or another related to other peoples. So that's one of the ongoing mysteries of the Meroitic writing. It's shown here as alphabetic, but my understanding of it is it was a syllabary. So instead of just the letter K, you would have ka, ke, ko, ku, ke, whatever the sounds are for each of these vowels, and are, you know, the consonant vowel combination. But anyway, this is well entrenched by the 2nd century BCE. You see a lot of funerary stela for various noble ladies and lords. Okay, and then this pattern, I spoke earlier about the stone altars, which are really libation tables. And this is an example of one of them where you've got the incised pattern. This one's not carved as much as incised, very commonly showing deities. So you have Nebthet and her consort Anpu, or Anubis, Nephthys in the Greek telling, making offerings on this table for the benefit of whoever has dedicated this. This is a little more characteristic. They're usually carved in relief, and there's always a square center. They're actually shown using one of these same stone altar tables. There's a channel for the poured offering to flow out through. So most commonly Nebthet and Anpu, Nephthys and Anubis, who are the rulers of the dead. That is their realm. So it's appropriate for their blessings to be sought by the person whose funerary offering these stelae are made for. But that libation pouring that we saw before, still happening. Here they are again, and right at the center, a really huge, deep ankh. And again, that channel for the poured offering to run off from. So this one I have an actual inscription translation. O Osiris, it is Abala. They think this might mean grandmother. Make her drink plentiful water, make her eat plentiful bread, may her be served a good meal. So this is for the continuing life of this woman who was given a pyramid burial at Sedeinga. This is another one of the late Meroitic sites. Here's one from Karanog. This is another of the late sites from this area, again showing the libation vessels pouring. And this one's interesting because it's like the steps going down into a chamber. So the libation would be poured into kind of a pool here. Bab Kalabsha from the exterior. And here again, we have a rock-cut temple, which has been supplemented with walls on the exterior area. Don't know a lot yet about this site, but it's really beautiful. And you can see some very extensive inscriptions there. And they're saying this is the Medjay king, Harmadoye. So the Medjay are coming into view here. And the Medjay are really present in this time span. I'll come back to them in a second. Here's another libation stone with just the ankh. So when the liquid was poured in, it would take the shape, the shimmering shape of the symbol of life. And the ankh is all over the place in the Meroitic ceramics. They did these really beautiful painted ceramics, a lot of times with ankh and rosette. The ankh engraved in a very characteristic Kushan style, here and here, where it was a cutout. Another example of a ritual offering stand. Oh, this one is actually a censer, they say, so burning incense on it. I drew these in a library like 45 years ago when there were no photocopiers in libraries, because they're just so amazing, and examples of what they're calling here blemye pottery. But the blemye is the Roman name for the Medjay, or the Bejas as they are now known. So this is a Nubian people, very much devoted to Isis. You can see the ankh all over the place here in their symbolism. And they were making pilgrimages out of Sudan and out of the desert to come to the Temple of Isis at Philae in the late Roman Empire. I'll come back to them in a minute. Balana is one of the very late sites. They have these amazing little winged Uraeus goddesses. I love them. This one has an ankh dripping from its mouth as if it was a plant. So cute. And here's an interesting thing. You remember at the early time I was talking about this stippled pattern. Here it still is, 3,000 years later. There is some kind of a consistent cultural through line, and maybe it didn't, I mean, there's gaps here, and yet here they are still using it. So they're side by side with the painted ankhs and all of this stuff. We see this much more archaic style, including the cattle that we saw from that very early period of the A group and the C group cultures. So the cord marking and the stipple patterns continue along. There's whole layers of what's happening with the common people here that are maybe not visible to us, at least as far as the gaps that I'm perceiving here archaeologically. They're also using the incisions and the impasto rubbings to make the patterns stand out. And so you've got Nile lilies and ankhs and various kinds of offerings, buds, the Sa symbol, which has to do with the belt of Isis, its protective powers. So Sudanese, if you look, especially 20 years ago, if you looked for Sudanese archaeology, you know, if you did a net search, if you tried to find something in the library, it could be very, very hard to locate. And yet I hope I'm showing you how massive, I can't even include everything I have in this show because I've already reached 90 minutes almost. But here's the ankh again. And so there's this very, very long and broad and deep cultural riches out of Sudan over a period of millennia. 6 millennia, which is what I've shown you, longer if you count the really old pottery fragments. They loved the frogs. This connection of frogs with rainfall may have something to do in this desert country of but the frog also, the goddess Heket, is important in Egypt as a kind of a liminal figure who oversees birth and death and magic. Heket, the goddess Heket. Here we see giraffes and serpents, more frogs. More serpents. This is interesting because it's got some continuity with the snake bowls that we saw from the C group culture, but they're separated by approximately 15 centuries. Here's a Hathor, as we can see from her cow ears, her crown, raising a blessing hand next to possibly the lion god. It's not really clear, and from just a fragment like this. Karanog, another late site, again, incised and painted symbols. And Sedegna, this is one of the sites I've just been reading about lately. It was discovered not that long ago, but it's another Meroitic capital, necropolis, actually, a burial ground for a lot of the royals in the late Meroitic period. And so we've got Hathor-headed capitals of a type we know very well from Egypt, glassware, and this amazing lintel of Ma'at. So the goddess of divine law, which is symbolized by the feather of Ma that she wears. This is, we can always pick her out from that. Sculptured in a very characteristically Nubian style. Got the date there. Amazing. And this is one of the last shreds that I've been able to find, this site of Hobagi Tum. I still don't know very much about it, but this very expertly incised piece of pottery showing a seated woman. She's kind of the center of this scene. Her daughter standing behind her with the acacia trees and a thatched house. A man bringing an offering in a ceremonial vessel, also bringing cattle. And then she's accompanied, perhaps this is a brother figure, which is what I'm going to conjecture rather than a husband, based on the matrifocal lineages that we see even in this late period. And it continues actually into the medieval period from some of the records, the written records that we have. So here, the weaving, showing the deities. These are all cotton weaving, indigo dyed weaving. We've got the key pattern showing up here. Nile lilies. Female figurines. So X group, 360 CE. This is a time where there's another group of people coming in. They're not really sure who they are. But we again begin to see human sacrifice in the tombs at Balana in this X group society. And at least 3 instances I'm aware of, they made these beautiful crowns, but at least 3 of the queens were sacrificially buried with the kings. This is something we don't know any trace of that from the Meroitic period, but some shift happens here. And there's this, you still see the god Amun featured very prominently in the feather crown and all these things. But there is this, not only the queens being sacrificed, but grooms and various servitors of the kings and animals sacrificed at their tombs. But this is really the last gasps of this long dynastic lineage, series of them actually, in Kush. This is the end of it. So then what happens? Along come the Byzantine Empire. They conquer Egypt. And the last stand of Isis at the Temple of Philae is fought by the Medjay, who the Romans are calling Blemmyes, but they're the Medjay, and they get driven out. They get forced away from the Nile Valley and driven into the Eastern Desert. And that is where they remain to become a desert people. But, you know, there's that long continuity historically of this group that we can trace back a couple thousand years in Egyptian history. And so the Bejas, the Medjay, and then by Roman times, they're calling them the Blemmyes. So the last defenders of Isis. All right, so we come up, we're in the 600, 700, 800, 900 of this era. And these maps are just to kind of show you what's going on. There's not as much iconography. And I'm not really here to show you a whole medieval Nubia because I said ancient Kush. But Nobatia, Nubia is actually named after the Noba, who we first read about in Strabo. It is not necessarily a self-name. We do know that there's a Nuba people in Kordofan, but they're not necessarily the same people either. So there are these kingdoms of Nobatia who allied with the Byzantines to drive the Blemmyes or the Medjay or the Bejas into the Eastern Desert. See, there's the Red Sea. They're pushed off away from the valley of the Nile. Then there's Makuria, which becomes a Christian kingdom with its center at Dongola. And then south of there, very far south, is Alodia. And what's interesting about this is that we have references. This one is from about the 1st century. The Nubians held their sisters in great honor, and their kings are succeeded by their sisters' sons, not by their own. So this is a foreign source talking in that time frame about a matrilineage. But we know from other sources, including Arab ones, that there was still matrilineage in the royal Christian dynasties of the Nuba at Old Dongola, which is in ruins here, and which we see showing up in cathedral murals in the 1100s and all the way up into the 1300s. Nubia remains a Christian kingdom, but it's being set upon by Arabs are starting to filter into the area and intermarry, and eventually the matrilineage gets lost because some of those Arabs are married in and their children become children of the matriline. And so this is where the whole matrilineage eventually, by 1300s, in the process of Islamicization, which is also going on, that matrilineage finally passes away, at least in terms of official lineage. Other culture patterns could show otherwise, because one of the things we see is the incredible staying power of culture, just as we've seen in this actual presentation. But that's a whole other background to Sudan. And I just want to wrap up here with some of these Nubian women. These are on the Egyptian side, where there is a continuation of, they're calling her a female magician with 5 spirits, but of priestly activity by women, women healers, the czar religion, priestesshood, ecstatic ceremony that continues in this part of the world. And very characteristic Nubian culture, including these kinds of jewelry, the women's habit of painting the adobe exterior of their houses with patterns, women's music and drumming, even the Nubian language. This is a Nilo-Saharan language family. Originally, it's been overlaid a lot by Arabic, but they still have traces of this. So we can go all the way from the red on black ware of the ancient Neolithic all the way up to the kings and queens of Balana. This is the great artist John Bigger's painting of Nubia that reclaims all of this and shows the ceremony and the gold smelting, because they were like major traders of gold as well as horses. The art forms, the ceremony, and the beautiful, beautiful mural. Look, he put the frogs in. Shows like this one, stream on demand recordings, are available of earlier webcasts at this same address. So you can also look those up if there's any topics that you're interested in.